The scanner beeped, shattering his carefully constructed life. "Welcome, Commander," the cold machine announced, exposing James' carefully buried past in an instant. His weathered hands trembled as he stood frozen in the doorway of what should have been a simple janitor interview. Single dad walked into a job interview wasn't supposed to end like this. Sophie waited outside, innocent, while 15 years of meticulous lies collapsed into dust with 3 mechanical words. James Parker wiped his sweaty palms against the thighs of his only decent pair of slacks, counting the fraying threads at the cuffs as the receptionist typed his information into the system. The government building's lobby smelled of industrial cleaner and recycled air, a sterile environment that reminded him of places he'd spent years trying to forget. Behind him, Sophie sat hunched over her phone, her dark hair falling forward to hide her face. A 16-year-old forced to accompany her father to yet another job interview during summer break. He hated bringing her, but their neighbor, Mrs. Wilkins, was visiting her sister in Baltimore, and he couldn't leave Sophie alone after what happened last time. The memory of coming home to find 3 boys from her school in their apartment, beer cans hidden poorly under the sofa, still made his jaw clench with a mixture of disappointment and fear. Not fear of teenage boys, but fear of what he might have done if he'd arrived while they were still trying to pressure his daughter. The receptionist looked up with the practiced smile of someone who had processed thousands of hopeful applicants before him. "The maintenance supervisor will see you shortly, Mr. Parker. We just need to run you through basic security screening. Standard procedure for anyone entering the facility, even for an interview." Her voice carried the efficient tone of government workers everywhere, people who moved papers and processed humans with equal detachment. James nodded, trying to look like someone who expected nothing more from life than to push a broom across polished floors for the next 10 years. It was a role he had perfected, the slightly defeated middle-aged man, invisible to most, harmless to all. He glanced back at Sophie, who looked up from her phone long enough to give him an encouraging thumbs up. The silent support in her eyes nearly broke him. She believed in him so completely, without knowing who he really was or what he had done in another lifetime. "Dad, you've got this," she mouthed silently, and he forced a smile in return. The maintenance job would pay better than his current night shift at the convenience store, with actual benefits that would cover Sophie's asthma medications without draining their meager savings. He'd applied on a whim after seeing the posting at the community center job board, never expecting to get an interview. The facility was some bland government research building, nothing to do with military operations according to his careful research, which had seemed safe enough. Now, standing in the sterile lobby with its American flag and bland inspirational posters about service and excellence, he felt the first prickles of unease crawling up his spine. Muscle memory from another life, sensing danger before conscious thought could identify it. James rolled his shoulders, trying to dispel the tension. He was being paranoid again, seeing threats where none existed, a habit Sophie gently teased him about when he insisted on checking the locks 3 times before bed. The security guard, a broad-shouldered man with the watchful eyes of someone who had seen combat, gestured James toward a metal detector archway that looked more sophisticated than the ones at airports. "Step through, please, sir. Place any metal objects, phone, keys, and wallet in the tray." The man's posture was too correct, his gaze too assessing for a simple security checkpoint, but James kept his face neutral as he emptied his pockets. Perhaps this facility was higher security than he'd realized, some government contract research that required clearances. If that was the case, he'd never get the job anyway. His fabricated background check would hold up against standard employment screening, but nothing more rigorous. Part of him felt relief at the thought. The other part remembered the cost of Sophie's medication and the unpaid electric bill sitting on their kitchen counter. James stepped through the scanner, expecting the usual electronic tone that would signal he was clear to proceed. Instead, the machine emitted a series of escalating beeps, and a red light began flashing overhead. The guard's hand instinctively moved toward his sidearm as he stared at the display screen with widening eyes. James felt his body automatically shifting into a defensive stance, weight balanced perfectly, hands loose at his sides. A movement so ingrained it happened before he could stop it. The small crowd of employees waiting to pass through security fell silent as a mechanical voice emanated from the scanner. "Identity confirmed. Welcome, Commander Parker." The words hung in the suddenly silent lobby, echoing in James's ears like a death knell. His carefully constructed life imploded in 3 words as the security guard's expression morphed from suspicion to shock to something like awe. Behind him, James could feel Sophie's confused gaze burning into his back. Colonel Harrison appeared within minutes, as though he'd been waiting for this moment, perhaps for years. His silver hair was cropped in the same military precision James remembered, though there were more lines etched around his eyes, testament to a decade and a half of stress and responsibility. "Commander Parker," he said, voice low and controlled as he approached. The title hit James like a physical blow, a name he hadn't heard or used in 15 years of careful anonymity. Behind him, Sophie had risen from her seat, confusion evident in her stance as security personnel subtly moved to block the exits. Harrison's eyes flickered briefly to Sophie, calculation clear in his gaze as he assessed the teenage girl's resemblance to her father. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation in my office." It wasn't a request, and James knew better than to treat it as one. Years of training and command experience surfaced like muscle memory as he straightened his posture involuntarily. "My daughter," James said, gesturing toward Sophie, who stood frozen near the reception desk, phone clutched forgotten in her hand. "She's waiting for me." The words came out with more authority than he'd allowed himself to use in years, the voice of a man accustomed to giving orders rather than taking them. Harrison nodded once, sharp and efficient, another remnant of their shared past. The colonel signaled to a female security officer who detached herself from the small cluster of personnel now gathered near the scanner. James watched the woman approach his daughter, saw Sophie's expression shift from confusion to concern to the beginning edges of fear. He wanted to go to her, to explain. But explanation would mean exposure, and exposure was what he'd been avoiding for 15 years of midnight relocations and identity changes. 15 years of protecting Sophie from the consequences of choices made before she was born. "Ms. Parker will be made comfortable in our waiting area. We have excellent Wi-Fi and a decent cafeteria." Harrison's words were pleasant, his tone anything but. James recognized the steel beneath the courtesy. This was not a negotiation. "We have much to discuss, Commander. Matters of significant national importance that have been on hold during your extended absence." The colonel's eyes hardened slightly on the last words, the only indication of the anger and frustration James's disappearance must have caused. The government didn't spend millions training special operators only to have them vanish into civilian life without warning, especially not operators with James's particular set of skills and clearances. Sophie was watching now, her intelligent eyes taking in every detail. The way the security personnel deferred to her father despite his shabby interview clothes. The tension vibrating between him and the silver-haired man. The sudden transformation in her father's bearing from humble job applicant to something else entirely. James met her gaze across the lobby, trying to communicate reassurance without words. Sophie had always been perceptive, too smart for her own good. Even as a child, she'd seemed to sense there was more to her father than the simple, cautious man who checked under her bed for monsters and taught her to throw a perfect spiral with a football. Now he could see the questions forming behind her eyes, connections being made as she watched this unfamiliar version of her father emerge from hiding. The female security officer had reached her now, was saying something in low, professional tones that made Sophie's shoulders tense. James took an instinctive step toward his daughter, but Harrison's hand closed around his upper arm with surprising strength for a man his age. "Commander, I strongly suggest we move this conversation somewhere more private, immediately." The emphasis on the last word carried layers of meaning, urgency, warning, threat. The lobby had emptied of civilian personnel, leaving only security staff and a few men and women in dark suits who hadn't been present minutes before. James recognized their type immediately. Intelligence officers, analysts, the kind of people who appeared when situations went sideways. One held a secure phone to his ear, speaking in the clipped tones of someone reporting up the chain of command. This was escalating faster than James could control, spinning beyond the careful boundaries he'd established around their lives. Sophie was being led toward a side door, looking back over her shoulder with an expression that twisted James's heart, not fear but determination. She wouldn't go quietly, his daughter. She had too much of her mother in her for that, and too much of him, though she didn't know it yet. The realization that he couldn't protect her from the truth anymore hit him with the force of a physical blow. 15 years of careful lies were dissolving around him like sugar in rain. Harrison was steering him toward an elevator bank, security personnel forming a loose cordon around them as they walked. "You've been away a long time, James," the colonel said, reverting to his first name in a subtle acknowledgement of their former friendship. "Things have changed. The world has changed. But some threats remain constant, evolving, but never disappearing." The elevator doors slid open at Harrison's approach, without him needing to press a button. Inside, James noted the absence of floor numbers, just a fingerprint scanner and retinal recognition system, high security beyond what should exist in a simple research facility. The realization settled like lead in his stomach. This building was a front for something else entirely, something connected to his former life, to the operations that had sent him into hiding with an infant daughter and a new identity. "We've been looking for you since Caracas," Harrison said quietly, as the elevator began to descend rather than rise. 15 years, 4 months, and 17 days. That's how long you've been a ghost, Commander." The office they entered bore little resemblance to the bureaucratic space James had expected. 30 floors below ground level, steel and concrete replaced the bland government-issue decor of the upper floors. Harrison's actual workspace was Spartan, military in its precision. A desk free of personal items, walls lined with secure monitors displaying data feeds from around the globe, and a large digital situation map dominating one wall. James recognized the markers and symbols, though the theaters of operation had shifted somewhat from his time. New hotspots had emerged, old ones had cooled or ignited into open conflict. The world continued its dangerous dance while he had been changing diapers, attending parent-teacher conferences, and working minimum-wage jobs under borrowed names. Harrison gestured to a chair positioned across from his desk, the only concession to visitors in the otherwise utilitarian space. James remained standing, a small act of defiance that brought the ghost of a smile to Harrison's weathered face. "Still stubborn, I see," the colonel remarked. Moving to a secure cabinet recessed into the wall, he pressed his palm against a biometric scanner, waited for the soft beep of recognition, then extracted a thick file folder stamped with classification markings that made James's throat tighten. Top secret wasn't even the highest designation visible on the worn folder. Harrison placed it on the desk between them, but didn't open it immediately. Instead, he studied James with the calculating gaze of a man accustomed to assessing threats and assets with equal precision. "You look different, softer around the edges. Civilian life has changed you." The words contained neither judgment nor approval, merely observation. The beard helps with the disguise, though the security system wasn't fooled. Biometric recognition has advanced considerably since you retired. The pause before the last word carried volumes of unspoken accusations. James hadn't retired, he'd vanished, taking with him knowledge and skills the government had invested heavily to develop. "I'm not coming back," James said, finding his voice at last. The words emerged stronger than he felt, echoing against the reinforced walls of the underground office. "Whatever crisis you're facing, whatever operation needs a commander, I'm not your man anymore." He thought of Sophie, probably sitting in some sterile waiting room upstairs, her world tilting on its axis as she tried to reconcile the father she knew with the man who warranted this level of security response. "I have a daughter, a life." Harrison's expression didn't change as he flipped open the file folder, revealing the top sheet. A surveillance photo of Sophie walking out of her high school, backpack slung over one shoulder, laughing at something out of frame. The timestamp showed it had been taken 3 weeks ago. James felt cold anger rising in his chest, an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years of careful self-control. "You've been watching my daughter?" The question emerged as a dangerous whisper, Commander Parker surfacing through the carefully constructed facade of James the civilian. "We've been protecting your daughter," Harrison corrected, turning the file to reveal more photos. Sophie at various ages, from elementary school through to the present. Different schools, different states, following the meandering path of their frequent relocations. "Did you really think you could disappear so completely? That an asset of your caliber would simply be written off as a loss?" The colonel shook his head slowly, disappointment evident in the gesture. "We've had eyes on you since Charlotte went rogue in Caracas. We knew she'd contacted you before the extraction went sideways. We knew you took the child and ran." Harrison's voice softened slightly on the mention of Charlotte, Sophie's mother. James felt the old wound reopen at the sound of her name, memories he'd locked away, surging back with painful clarity. Charlotte's fierce intelligence, her determination, the way she'd looked at him in those final moments before everything fell apart. "She died believing you were compromised, James. She died thinking you had betrayed the operation." The accusation hung in the air between them, heavier than the classified files, more dangerous than the security protocols surrounding them. James gripped the back of the chair he'd refused to sit in, knuckles whitening with the effort of restraint. Charlotte was the one who was compromised. She was working with Vega's people. I saw the transfer records myself. The words tasted bitter after 15 years of silence. The official narrative he'd never believed but couldn't disprove while on the run with an infant daughter. Harrison's expression shifted subtly, a micro-expression that wouldn't have been visible to anyone without James's training. Surprise, quickly masked. "You didn't know," James realized aloud, the pieces realigning in his mind. "All these years, you thought I was the one who betrayed the team, that I took Sophie and ran because I was the double agent." The revelation struck him with physical force, nearly buckling his knees as 15 years of hypervigilance, of looking over his shoulder, of teaching Sophie to recognize surveillance and exit strategies, suddenly appeared in a new light. Harrison closed the file folder with deliberate care, his movements precise as he gathered his thoughts. New information has come to light in recent months. Intelligence that suggests neither you nor Charlotte were the security breach we believed. The colonel reached for a secure tablet embedded in his desk, typing a rapid sequence that brought up a series of documents on the nearest monitor. James recognized the format instantly, after-action reports, intelligence analyses, surveillance transcripts. 3 months ago, we captured a former member of Vega's inner circle, During enhanced interrogation, he revealed that both you and Charlotte had been framed by a third party, someone who wanted Vega to believe U.S. intelligence had penetrated his organization. Harrison swiped to another document, this one showing a familiar face that made James's pulse quicken. Miguel Vega, the target of the operation that had gone so catastrophically wrong 15 years ago. Vega is alive, James. The body we recovered from the compound was a double, and now he's resurfaced with resources and a very specific vendetta. The implications crashed over James in waves, each realization more devastating than the last. If Vega was alive, if he knew about Sophie. James sank into the chair he'd been avoiding, legs no longer able to support him, as the truth reconstructed itself in his mind. You're telling me that for 15 years I've been running from the wrong enemy? That I've kept Sophie hidden from her own government when the real threat was still out there? His voice sounded hollow to his own ears, the weight of 15 years of misplaced vigilance crushing down on him. Harrison nodded once, the gesture carrying no satisfaction despite the vindication it represented for his organization. That's why the security scanner recognized me today, James continued, following the thread to its logical conclusion. You updated my status in the system. You're not hunting me anymore. You're trying to bring me in from the cold. The colonel's silence was confirmation enough. Upstairs, Sophie was waiting, unaware that every story her father had ever told her about their past was constructed from carefully shaped half-truths and strategic omissions, unaware that the random job interview at a nondescript government building had just exposed them to dangers far beyond anything James had prepared her to face. Sophie Parker had never seen her father afraid. Cautious, yes, obsessively so at times, with his insistence on memorizing exit routes from every building they entered, his rules about social media and digital footprints, his almost pathological avoidance of cameras. But never afraid, not even when they'd fled their apartment in Arizona in the middle of the night 3 years ago, her father throwing essentials into backpacks with grim efficiency after spotting what he called surveillance patterns around Sophie's middle school. Now, watching him emerge from the elevator with the silver-haired man, Sophie saw something new in her father's expression, a complex mixture of resignation, resolve, and fear. Not fear for himself, she realized with sudden clarity, but fear for her, the kind of bone-deep fear that comes from loving someone so completely that their safety becomes more important than your own existence. She straightened in the uncomfortable waiting room chair, setting aside the untouched sandwich and soda the female security officer had brought her, preparing herself for whatever came next. "Sophie," her father said, his voice steadier than his eyes as he crossed to where she sat. He knelt before her chair, a posture she remembered from childhood when he needed to tell her something important, that they were moving again, that she needed to use a different last name at her new school, that Mom wasn't coming back, ever. "I need to tell you some things I should have explained years ago, but I thought—" He trailed off, searching for words. Sophie felt a chill settle in her stomach. Whatever was happening, it was worse than she had imagined during the hour she'd spent in this sterile room, generating and discarding theories about her father's strange reception. "You're not really a janitor, are you?" The question slipped out before she could stop it, direct and unvarnished in the way teenagers often are. A ghost of a smile touched her father's lips, there and gone in an instant, replaced by a seriousness she had rarely seen. "No, Sophie, I'm not. I never was." He glanced at the silver-haired man who stood a respectful distance away, giving them the illusion of privacy in a room Sophie had already identified as being under surveillance, with cameras disguised in the ceiling fixtures and what was almost certainly a two-way mirror along one wall. Her father followed her gaze to the hidden camera she'd spotted, pride flickering briefly across his features before solemnity returned. You always were too observant for your own good, just like your mother." The mention of her mother, a subject so rarely discussed that Sophie had learned not to ask, confirmed that whatever was happening transcended their normal boundaries. "Before you were born, before I became your father, I was someone else. I worked for the government, for this government, in a capacity I can't fully explain even now." His hands, always so steady when teaching her to change a tire or dress a wound, trembled slightly as he reached for hers. Sophie's mind raced, connecting dots she hadn't known existed until this moment. Her father's insistence on physical training disguised as play when she was young, the strange skills he possessed that didn't match his supposed background, the hypervigilance she had internalized so completely she hadn't recognized it as abnormal until her first sleepover at age 12, when she realized other families didn't check their locks 3 times before bed. "The scanner called you Commander," she said slowly, processing this new information against the backdrop of their nomadic existence. "Commander Parker, were you military?" She searched his face for confirmation, for any sign that would help her reconstruct the stranger who had raised her, this man who apparently warranted government security protocols and underground meetings. Her father hesitated, clearly measuring his response against security classifications that suddenly seemed very real. "Special operations, initially," he finally said, the admission clearly costing him something vital. "Later, intelligence work, assignments that don't exist on paper, the kind of operations that countries deny knowledge of when they go wrong." He spoke carefully, each word selected with precision, aware of both the surveillance and the fragile trust he was trying to preserve with his daughter. 15 years ago, an operation in South America went catastrophically wrong. Your mother was there. We both were. Intelligence officers working under deep cover. Sophie felt the world tilting beneath her, reality realigning itself around this new nucleus of information. The mother she barely remembered, whose face she knew only from 3 precious photographs her father had preserved through all their moves, had not been the humanitarian aid worker described in the bedtime stories of her childhood. The revelation should have been shocking, but instead felt like the final piece clicking into a puzzle she hadn't known she was solving. "The operation was compromised," her father continued, his voice dropping lower despite the futility of privacy. "People died. Good people, colleagues, friends. Your mother was killed in the extraction attempt." He swallowed hard, old grief etching new lines around his eyes. "I was blamed for the failure. There was evidence suggesting I had betrayed the team, sold information to our target. It was fabricated evidence, but convincing enough that I couldn't stay to fight it, not with you to protect." His gaze held hers, willing her to understand the impossible choice he had faced. "You were just 6 months old. Your mother had hidden you with a local family she trusted, anticipating that the operation might go wrong. Her last act was to send me your location. So I took you and I ran. Sophie, I created new identities for us, kept us moving whenever I sensed we might have been found. I raised you as far from this world as I could manage." The weight of 15 years of deception hung between them, heavier than Sophie could have imagined possible. The silver-haired man, Colonel Harrison, she had gathered from snippets of conversation, stepped forward then, his movement deliberate enough to telegraph his approach. "Miss Parker," he said, addressing her directly for the first time, "your father has been operating under a significant misapprehension for 15 years. We now have conclusive evidence that he was not responsible for the failure in Caracas. In fact, both your parents were victims of an elaborate frame designed to disguise the real traitor." Sophie watched her father's face as Harrison spoke, saw the complex emotions warring there. Vindication, grief, a flash of anger quickly suppressed. "The man responsible for your mother's death, for the entire operation's compromise, is still alive. and recent intelligence suggests he may be aware of your existence." The colonel delivered this final revelation with clinical precision, but Sophie caught the underlying note of genuine concern. The implications crystallized in her mind with terrifying clarity. Their years of running hadn't been paranoia, but necessity. And now even that precarious safety had been stripped away by a chance encounter with a security scanner, programmed to recognize a man her father had stopped being 15 years ago. "So what happens now?" Sophie asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice as she directed the question to both men. "We can't just go back to our apartment after this, can we?" Udin, the practical question, seemed to catch her father off guard. Perhaps he had expected tears or accusations. The emotional outburst of a teenage girl discovering her entire life had been constructed on necessary lies. Instead, Sophie found herself thinking with the same strategic clarity she had observed in her father throughout her childhood, assessing threats and calculating responses. Harrison exchanged a glance with her father, some unspoken communication passing between them that spoke of years of shared experiences predating Sophie's existence. Her father's shoulders straightened almost imperceptibly, his posture shifting in a subtle way that transformed him before her eyes. James Parker, the cautious single dad with the janitor job application, receding to reveal Commander Parker, the man who had navigated clandestine operations and international intrigue. The dichotomy should have been jarring, but instead felt like the final revelation of someone she had glimpsed only in fragments throughout her life, in the way he entered rooms, in his awareness of sightlines, in the controlled precision of even his most casual movements.